So even though I've got Q&As building up that I should probably be addressing and other topics, I'm too lazy to do it. And since I want to try to keep up a relatively continuous content, even if little Milo Wolf thinks that I'm a grade D influencer because I hurt his feelings. This is a kid who thinks that good morning drop sets are a good idea. So fuck you, Milo. Anyway, I want to do a series of videos on basic training principles. Because what I'm starting to really realize is everybody does so much content on, advanced stuff, mainly to keep everyone fucking confused so they can get that sweet YouTube revenue by cranking out bullshit videos. But it's clear to me that both among general trainees, who again I'm not criticizing because you can't know what you don't know, but also among supposed fitness professionals who should know this shit, the basic principles have been forgotten. And I don't know why this is. I don't know if these people need a refresher course. I suspect it's because when you go to shitty online universities like Brad, you don't get the basic information. So apparently it's my responsibility to put it out there. So in the next series of videos, and if I get it together, I'll intercut it with some Q&As. I want to look at what are generally considered the basic principles of training. Now, I'm not going to look at it universally in terms of, endurance sports, although I have that background, sprint sports, which I'm shitty and have very little, well, no good background in, even though I did do it when I was speed skating. Powerlifting, which I do have a lot of experience with, elite world record holding female powerlifter. And mainly I'll focus on bodybuilding because, let's face it, people give a shit about hypertrophy. So first, let me look at the list of basic training principles. So the main ones you'll typically see are specificity, or SED, and I'll explain that here shortly. Overload / progressive overload, which I've ranted about in a couple videos already. Individualization, reversibility. Depending on what list you come across, you may also see variety, periodization, adaptation and accommodation, the fit principle, and supercompensation. And if you're wondering what really separates the top list, the primary list, from that secondary list, is one of necessity. The components in the primary list are required. It is not training without them. Those principles are not optional. Whereas, as I'll kind of mention briefly as I get to it, but certainly in the longer videos, the ones in that second set are not mandatory. They may be useful, they may be beneficial, they may be important, but that doesn't mean they're necessarily mandatory. And one of them is just so descriptive anyway, it doesn't really, none of this applies to it. But I'll get to that in the individual videos, so just be patient. So in this video, just sort of as a means of introduction, I'm just going to kind of look at each of those in a general sense of what they represent. And then in subsequent videos, I will look at each of them in varying degrees of detail because I think they have varying degrees of importance or relevance individually, or in some cases I might look at a couple together because there ain't shit to say about it. So I put specificity and SED at the top because they're very primary, and they're two sides of the same coin. So specificity simply says that the training that is done should be specific to the goal of what you're trying to improve. Specificity, it's right there in the name. So as some quick examples, right, if you want to improve your endurance, you do endurance training. You don't go to the weight room, you don't stretch. If you're trying to get a bigger 1 rep max bench press, you don't go run or fuck about with sets of 35 or squat. If you're trying to get more flexible, you don't run, you do mobility training. And realize this is meant to be a simple introduction. I'll get into the details in a next video or in another video. So that's specificity. Training must be specific to what you're trying to develop. SAID, S-A-I-D, which stands for Specific Adaptations to Imposed Demands, is, like I said, the flip side of that coin. And what it says is that the adaptation that occurs to a specific type of training is specific to the imposed demands. So if you ride a bike for long durations, the specific adaptation will be an improvement in endurance. If you do top speed sprint work, The specific adaptation will be an improvement in your ability to sprint quickly. If you practice low repetition weight training, the specific adaptation will be an improvement in your maximum strength. Again, yes, I realize there can be growth. I'm talking about general principles here. So specificity and SAID, or SAID, specific adaptations to imposed demands, seems fairly self-explanatory. Let me move on. So next up is overload and progressive overload. And I ranted about this in a previous video, and these are commonly confused, which is why it's important for me to discuss them again. Overload simply says that your current training load constitutes, well, an overload, meaning that it is a stimulus to cause your body to adapt and improve your fitness. Now, what that load is will depend. It will depend on what you're trying to develop, aerobic endurance versus anaerobic glycolysis versus top speed versus hypertrophy versus maximum strength. Depends on your fitness level. Depends on a whole host of factors. But it simply means that your current training load is at a point, usually relative to some, whatever your current fitness is especially, that it's able to stimulate further adaptation. And that's really an acute thing. And when I say acute, I don't mean single workout. That could be for a week. It could be for a month. It could be for a varying amount of time, depending on the specifics. And again, separate video. Now that tends to get confused with progressive overload, sometimes just called progression, which is probably a better way to distinguish them for people who are unclear on what words mean, i.e. most of the fitness industry. Progressive overload means that over time, as you adapt to your current training load, you must progress that training to keep making further gains. Does that make sense? Overload is more short-term, where short-term can mean time durations of, quite a bit. Beginner may get an overload and get an adaptation very quickly, whereas high-level athletes, like my elite female powerlifter, take 13 weeks to really get a significant improvement and be able to hit new PRs. So all progressive overload says is, as you adapt, as you get stronger, more enduring, faster, bigger, you must progress the training. But where people fuck this up is this current modern cretinous moronic idea that progressive overload must occur on some frequency. And the example I gave in the previous video was during that bullshit debate with Mike Israetel of the Brad's volume study. Mike said, well, you can't add weight every week, but you can add sets. Well, that's a lovely straw man. I never said you had to add weight every week, or every workout, or every month. There is no specific or determined frequency with which you should be adding to your training load. Progressive overload means adding to the training after you make the adaptation. So how quickly that occurs depends on how quickly you're adapting. Beginners adapt faster than intermediates, intermediates adapt faster than advanced. And the highest elite athletes adapt the most slowly of all. Overload, the immediate training load, where immediate can be a varying time period, that will stimulate a further adaptation. Progressive overload, or progression, means that as you adapt, over whatever time frame that may be, you must increase the training load, assuming you want to keep improving fitness. If you don't, you just stay at your current training load. That's what maintenance is. Next up, individualization, and I don't have a lot to say about this. It simply says that the training, in terms of the load, the types of training being done within specificity, how often progressive overload occurs, must be individualized for the person. And that's really it. Although, again, in the modern fitness industry, in terms of social media content, that is a nuance that's left out. Because I get that Instagram requires you to make a single trite image to try to, include supposed information. But nuance is left out. People will say, you should do this amount of volume. No nuance, no individualization, no even consideration of any of the other variables that go into this. Who are we talking about? A beginner, an intermediate, an advanced, an elite athlete? Are we talking about an 18-year-old college kid? Are we talking about an obsessed bodybuilder who does nothing but train, eat, and sleep? Are we talking about a 40-year-old individual with very little training background who's got a family? Same thing with frequency or intensity. I mean, and this applies across sports. It's one thing to be an obsessed endurance athlete who can ride a bike 6 days a week for 2 to 3 hours. If you work and have a job, or it's winter, or any number of reasons, that prescription doesn't help. So individualization, in its simplest sense, and I probably can't even get a full video out of this because I can't go into all the variables that might do it, and I have very little more to say than this. The training must be individualized to the individual. It's right there in the name. And there can be other aspects of that, psychological needs, things of that nature, but again, not going to get too deep into that. Since I should be better at marketing myself, when I do consultations with people, these are the things I take in. What I'm going to give a 45-year-old with 3 days a week to train, who wants to maintain general strength or hypertrophy or fat loss, will be very different than someone who's a full-time athlete. It's very difficult. Now, I get it. I mean, it's very difficult to express this in a video, to give all the things I take into account, but it should at least be acknowledged. And the mainstream fitness industry doesn't fucking do it. Because either they don't know how to, because most of these dipshits know how to train themselves, and that's about it, or they're too lazy, or they know that will confuse the people who watch their videos who need lots of simple guidelines, even if they're shit. Moving on. I have even less to say about reversibility, which simply says, if you stop training, or stop training at a sufficient level, your gains go away. It's just that simple. How quickly they go away, what order they go away in, depends. You typically lose top-end stuff like top speed on a bike or in sprinting. Maximal strength in the weight room typically goes away a little bit faster than lower-level stuff like aerobic endurance, even muscle hypertrophy. Again, I'm not sure I can get a full video out of that because unless I get into the time courses of the detraining literature, which I haven't looked at and can't really be bothered to, I don't think I can get a whole video out of that. So moving into the second group, the first one is variety, and you will sometimes see this in the list of training principles and other times you won't. And a lot of that, back in the day, it used to be thought that variety in training was sort of a driver on adaptation. And I don't know that that idea is really held quite as strongly now. I mean, if you look at the practices of elite athletes, there's arguably less variety than there ever has been. The level of competition is so high, athletes just can't afford to get away from their primary sporting movement for long periods of time. They just can't. They just don't have time to fuck about with lots of variety with this type of thing. You know, back the Soviets, for example, you know, there was one of their theorists said that as athletes got more advanced, they would need more variety. And they had like 100 squat variants and all these clean and jerk variants. And the reality is that in the modern era, the exact opposite is true. Most of the training being done year-round is specific, with other stuff being done. Now, some of this, of course, depends on what do you mean by variety? Is it changing exercises? Is it changing loading? Is it changing the duration of endurance event or the relative intensity? That could technically be considered as variety, but there's sort of this idea that variety in and of itself can continue to stimulate adaptations, and I happen to disagree with that. You can find too many people, too many athletes, too many systems that do not include a lot of variety, and people do just fine. And you'll find systems that do use a lot of variety. I'm not saying it's, you know, not done, but I'm saying I don't personally consider it necessarily a required training variability or training principle. And again, might get a full video out of that because I think it's worth discussing, especially in the context of hypertrophy and variety and changing exercises. You know, gotta confuse the muscle and shock the system, and the only people confused are the ones still saying that shit. But moving on. So periodization, which again you will see on some lists but not on others, I don't consider it one of the general training principles. I consider it an organizational strategy. Periodization in the most general sense refers to structuring training usually in some way to try to target a specific goal. It kind of came out of sports training where you were working towards the Olympics or a championship or a big event and how you altered your training. on a month-to-month basis, or generally or across the year. And there were macrocycles and mesocycles and microcycles and all that stuff. But it has less to do with general principles. And again, it's a way of organizing training. And just like variety, like, yes, people go, oh, but all the top athletes, use periodization. Well, as Drescher pointed out in his encyclopedia, so did all the athletes who failed. So that's not really a stunning argument. You can find systems, great athletes who reach the highest levels without doing periodization, at least in the sense that the word is typically used, and you can find lots of systems that do. So I'm not saying it's good or it's bad. I'm saying that, like variety, I mean, yeah, it can have its places. I don't see it as mandatory. There's also the issue that, like variety, a lot of it depends on what you're using the term to mean. And periodization has become this global catch-all to represent a lot of different things, many of which probably don't fall under the heading of periodization. So it's just become a term that doesn't mean anything. So like I said, it can be useful. It's not required in my opinion. And I could probably do a bunch of videos on just periodization and different models and all the debates over what it is and what it isn't, and is it valid and all that shit, and we'll see. So adaptation and accommodation is another one of those where those words tend to get confused and thrown about, frequently improperly. Where you hear people say that, oh, you need to change the training variety when you've adapted to it. Well, that's not true, right? Adaptation just is exactly that. In response to your current overload, you've gotten, more enduring, faster, bigger, stronger, whatever. That's adaptation, and that's a good thing. The point of training is to adapt. Accommodation really refers to the idea that the current training load you have accommodated to. It is no longer providing a stimulus, and it is no longer causing you to get better, which is a negative thing. And like I said, these get thrown around. Adaptation is what we seek from training. That's the goal, is to adapt to the training so we get, again, more enduring, stronger, faster, bigger, whatever. Accommodation means that the current training load your body has gotten used to on some level, and that's it. Again, maybe a full video, don't have a hell of a lot more to say about that. Moving on. So despite the name, I don't really consider the FIT principle as a general training principle. I mean, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Like I said, you don't always see it in the list, and you'll see it also called the FIT equation. Now, FIT stands for frequency, intensity, time, and type, which you can think of as how often, how hard, how long, and what you're doing. And those terms mean very different things, or can mean different things for endurance sports versus, again, sprinting, which I won't get into, the weight room activities, whether it's performance-oriented or bodybuilding. Again, I don't consider that general principle because it's more of a descriptor of some of the variables that go into what may constitute overload or progressive overload. So like periodization, it's sort of more of a, it's not organizational, but it's more descriptive. And this is also something that the fitness industry has just either doesn't understand, ignores, or just fucks up completely. Because you can't talk about any one of these variables in isolation of the other. So when someone says, train a muscle group 3 times a week, well, what does that mean? It means nothing without knowing the intensity. How hard? Without knowing the time, which in endurance sports is usually durational or distance, and in the weight room sports is usually set count, less so. I mean, workout duration doesn't tell you shit. And then type of activity, it's riding a bike. Is it squatting? Is it leg pressing? Is it leg extensions? What are you doing? You cannot consider any one of those variables in isolation, yet that's exactly what people do when they go, well, don't train to failure, do train to failure. Train at 4 reps in reserve. Train like Mike Isertel, like a complete baby, and take drugs and then claim that it's not the steroids that are responsible for your growth, as he criticizes other people hilariously on YouTube for, oh, they're just letting the drugs drive the bus. Mike, self-aware much? Your gains come out of a fucking needle, and we all know it. My point being that You can't talk about intensity or time or frequency or type of activity without taking them into account. And that will be a long video because, and I've done videos about that relative to failure training, but I'll discuss it again in more detail. And then finally is supercompensation, which I don't consider a training principle because as it's commonly or typically or still described and discussed and explained, it doesn't exist. And it's not a thing. And I did do a long video about that, but I'll do another one that's a little bit more generalized. Now you'll also see this called overcompensation and described a subtly different way that's a little more accurate in terms of the adaptations, which I already discussed. But supercompensation, as it's typically conceptualized, it doesn't exist. It's not a thing. And that's all there is to it. And there you go, under 20 minutes. That's probably a record for me. So those are the general training principles that I'm going to discuss in this video series, which are specificity or SED, overload/progressive overload, individualization, reversibility, which will probably be combined because I don't have a lot to say about them, variety, periodization, adaptation versus accommodation, the fit principle, and supercompensation. So next time, specificity and SED in altogether too much detail. Since I keep bringing her up, I wanted to announce that my trainee Sumi Singh has a new book out titled Becoming a Mentally Tough Motherfucker: How Elite Powerlifting Made Me a Better Person, Parent, and Partner, with both a foreword and epilogue by yours truly, which is a guide to all of the mental training skills she developed over the 8 years of her incredible elite powerlifting career. Topics include goal setting, dealing with resistance, setbacks, failures, journaling, anxiety on the big day if you do compete or have some sort of big demonstration or event, and also what to do when you choke, among many, many, many other things. The book has finally been published and is available on Amazon for Kindle purchase right now. If you are in a different country, you will have to go to your specific Amazon and search on her name, which is Sumi Singh, Sumisingh. You will not be able to get it from Amazon.com unless you're in the United States for Amazon reasons. You do not have to have a Kindle to get it. You need some sort of Kindle reader, and Amazon does have a cloud Kindle reader to read it on the website. So if you don't have the device, don't worry about it. If you prefer physical books, because you're an old fart like me, you can buy it in hard copy form as well on Amazon, and I'll put the links in the video notes. Buy it. Buy it now. Tell your friends. Tell your enemies. Tell everyone. And consider buying a gift copy for both Mike Israetel and little Milo Wolf, because goddamn, those two insecure little narcissists need all the help they can get butching the fuck up. See you next time. For the record, I neither read nor respond to comments on YouTube or Instagram, because I don't care. Mind you, I don't delete comments I don't like most of the weak-minded babies in this industry either. If you think my content is great and want to tell me how awesome I am, fantastic. If you think I'm a dumb asshole and want to call me names, also fantastic. I don't care either way, because I have better things to do. If you have questions that you want me to potentially read and or respond to, or most likely ignore, send them to questions@bodyrecomposition.com. Might get to them, might not. It's part of my charm. Oh yeah, I recently added a playlist to my channel, my buddy Solomon Nelson, who does some fantastic videos taking down the cretins in this industry. I've put the link directly to that playlist in the video comments, and you can also find them however you find playlists. He deserves the exposure. Go check him out.